He was the champion who defied all odds, a true inspiration to millions. But one fateful night changed everything. This is the shocking story of Oscar Pistorius' final hours before the world woke up to a devastating headline. As the sun had yet to rise above the horizon, the stillness of the night began to yield slowly to the first hints of daylight. In a gated residential complex surrounded by high walls on the outskirts of Johannesburg, the name Oscar Pistorius had come to mean far more than just that of an athlete. No one could have predicted that this seemingly ordinary daybreak would escalate into events that would remain ingrained in memory for years to come. Yet fate was already unfolding, unstoppable. In those early morning hours, there was no apparent sense of anything extraordinary in the neighborhood. The sky readied itself to meet the bright African sun, and between the occasional calls of birds and the distant murmur of the city, the prevailing calm was typical of dawn. Security cameras steadily recorded the comings and goings at the entrances, while patrolling guards made their routine rounds. Inside Oscar Pistorius' home, however, it was likely the start of a day that would become significant in ways no one could have imagined. He had removed his prostheses during the night. Now, as he moved to the edge of his bed, one imagines him pausing in a momentary reverie over the day's plans. According to the records, Pistorius spent the first minutes of that morning checking a few brief messages on his phone, going through emails, or perhaps mentally noting his usual athletic routine for the day. Officially, there was no major race or formal training scheduled. Nonetheless, given his background as an athlete, he was almost certain to spend some time in early morning exercise or a quick run, an essential daily discipline. What added a hint of significance to this particular morning, however, was that it happened to be Valentine's Day, an occasion that for many couples holds special meaning. In the case of Pistorius and his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp, it was reported that some form of celebration or event was planned that day. Sources indicate Steenkamp had television appearances or other commitments, possibly affecting how they divided up their hours. Yet from the outside, there was only the impression of a calm routine. No raised voices, no sign of conflict or impending trouble. One imagines Pistorius attaching his prostheses, heading to the kitchen for his morning coffee. Following the regimen typical of athletes, he may have scanned the newspaper headlines or quickly prepared a breakfast, perhaps leaning toward a protein-heavy meal or a light carb intake. Nobody is certain. From the vantage point of a detached observer, however, it all seemed entirely ordinary for the first hours of that day. Gradually, sunlight began to fill the interior spaces and everything about the athlete. His physical preparations, his mental focus, his future plans, likely converged in a silent interplay of morning routine. The gentle hum of a television or soft music in the background might have served as a soundtrack to this peaceful scene. Yet the very normalcy of the moment, in retrospect, proved to be a prelude to the turmoil that would come. From what we know, there was no sign of agitation or foreboding within Pistorius that morning. Later statements and official records show no unusual activity or disturbance. Phone conversations, emails, or messages he exchanged pointed to a normal day. This sense of calm, of a day like any other, now seems like a tragic calm before the storm. Despite having achieved iconic status, being the first double amputee to compete at the Olympics, the inherent pressure of living life in the public had become second nature to Pistorius. Even so, it would not have been unusual for him to reflect on his status in the athletic world, the constant media attention, and the goals he had yet to achieve. Perhaps thoughts of a surprise in store for Valentine's Day ran through his mind, possibly some last-minute detail that needed tending to in the garden or around the house. Maybe he stepped outside briefly, noting the sprinklers hissing softly, a soothing backdrop to his own internal stillness. No one realized that this morning would mark a pivotal turning point. Though time seemed to move slowly, the forces of life continued unobstructed on their courses, inexorably writing the final lines of this fateful day. The quiet normalcy of the hour, with no voices raised, no disturbances, served only to intensify the tragedy that would later unfold. Seemingly nothing was amiss, yet unseen, the seeds of catastrophe had already been sown. Thus, The day's first glimmer of daylight shed no sign of the dark shadow that would eventually cast itself over everyone involved. Time slipped by, and with it the illusion of an unremarkable morning, one that would soon lead to the dire events that would mark the end of this particular story. As the morning progressed, the sun's rays grew more pronounced, illuminating the city and its outskirts with a vibrant glow. Oscar Pistorius, having wrapped up his brief morning routine, turned to the usual tasks that filled his day. In normal circumstances, he would spend the hours following breakfast at a training session, perhaps on the track or in the gym. But, according to the available records, that day held no strict training schedule. There are indications that Pistorius made at least one short phone call to discuss work or personal matters, though there are no precise details about the content or the recipient. For a high-profile athlete juggling multiple sponsorships and business negotiations, calls like these would hardly be unusual. Observed from outside, it was simply another day, a typical interlude of phone calls and minor errands. As midday approached, security camera footage places Pistorius briefly out of his home, traveling somewhere in the city. The widely circulated theory is that he visited a shopping center or cafe, possibly to pick out a small Valentine's Day gift for Riva Steenkamp or to shop for sports equipment, given his athletic interests. None of this can be verified entirely, though it seems clear he left the property and returned sometime around midday, as evidenced by the gated community's access logs. During these hours, there was no hint of disturbance or discord. Neighbors, security guards, and official records point to no arguments, no alarm, and no visible signs that anything was amiss. Social media, which offered occasional glimpses into celebrities' daily lives, gave no sign of unusual posts concerning messages or blatant emotional turmoil. The outward appearance was that everything was moving along normally. Yet, as in many tragic stories, the calm often precedes the storm. Subtle clues may have gone unnoticed: an uncharacteristic mood, a brief moment of tension, a hint of dread. Nothing concrete was reported, but the haunting possibility remains that small indicators may have been overlooked. Regardless, Pistorius returned to his residence after an uneventful jaunt into the city, going through the usual protocols at the gate, with the guards seeing nothing out of place. Reports indicate that at some point in the late afternoon, there was contact between Pistorius and Riva Steenkamp about their plans for Valentine's Day. Observers confirmed that they intended to spend at least some time together that evening, hinting at a romantic or celebratory occasion. Even then, the day seemed no different from any other. In short, this phase was marked by a veneer of normalcy. Neighbors did not register any elevated noise levels, nor did the local security staff have reason to suspect trouble. The single abiding impression is one of quiet routine, which, with hindsight, acquires a more ominous feel. The day advanced under a benign sun, and no one recognized the coming darkness. Looking at the city's broader picture, there were likely other news items occupying the local press. Local events, political developments, sports announcements unrelated to Pistorius. Consequently, no headlines surfaced about any imminent crisis. Everything pointed to just another quiet day in the gated luxury compound. And yet, that very ordinariness only deepened the tragedy that would soon erupt. The most iconic aspects of such events are often how abruptly life can change. Hours earlier, the world at large had no reason to suspect that behind the immaculate lawns and security fences, a life-altering moment would unfold in the night to come. Thus, the day advanced into afternoon, with Pistorius presumably attending to his personal affairs or simply resting. Still, the day's events were propelling him, unbeknownst to anyone, toward a pivotal chapter. Even if not one person sensed the undercurrent of tension, the last hours of the day ticked down, carrying him closer to the irrevocable. By late afternoon, the sun's heat began to wane, and the sky took on a bronze tint, hinting at dusk. All across the city, office workers set out on their commutes, traffic thickened, and the hum of routine life rose to a crescendo. Taxis lined up outside buildings, and pedestrians filled the sidewalks, eager to be home. Meanwhile, in the quiet lanes of the gated community, the security cameras maintained their fixed, watchful gaze at every entrance, capturing the final hours of what appeared to be a normal day. Among the few details confirmed for this time period is that Riva Steenkamp arrived at Oscar Pistorius' home sometime before nightfall. Security records indicate she entered the compound after passing routine checks at the gate. By all external appearances, it was the simple scenario of a couple reuniting on Valentine's Day, presumably to spend a pleasant evening together. Once she was inside the house, the official narrative grows hazy. Later media reports and court proceedings shed only limited light on the early part of that evening, leaving significant gaps. Perhaps the two shared a meal, prepared dinner, and talked. It is uncertain whether they planned to stay in or dine out. Witnesses in neighboring homes stated they heard no arguments, no disturbances. If the pair quarreled or if tensions simmered beneath the surface, it went undetected by any outside observer. As night approached, it became clear that the couple would spend the rest of the evening at home. The usual comings and goings in the gated community had slowed, and no record indicates any plan for the two to leave the residence. There was a subdued quiet, standard for an affluent neighborhood, as families settled in behind closed doors. While this may have looked like an ordinary evening, retrospective accounts describe it with an undertone of foreboding. In many tragic stories, the final hours before catastrophe often present an unnatural calm, like the hush that settles just before a storm breaks. People who lived nearby later gave statements indicating nothing seemed unusual. No loud voices, no hurried visitors, and no signs of conflict. During those hours, the city beyond the compound walls also settled into its nightly rhythm. Streetlights flickered on, residents relaxed after a long day, and the sounds of televisions and distant traffic filled the background. Inside Pistorius' home, however, the tension that would culminate in a tragedy later in the night was quietly mounting. At some point, darkness fully took hold, the sky peppered with stars in the South African night. The house remained quiet from an external point of view. Security cameras outside could only show that no one left or entered aside from Steenkamp. Alarm systems presumably armed, locked doors, and the privacy of high walls gave every impression of safety. Yet, as the hours advanced and midnight drew near, the fateful trajectory was nearly unstoppable. In many renditions of that evening, suggestions arise that perhaps some unease or minor disagreement occurred between the couple. Still, no phone records, no definitive forensic evidence from that time have emerged to confirm it. Neighbors made no calls reporting shouts or disturbances. All that remains is a sense that, like a taut string, the night had been stretched nearly to its limit. By late evening, many in the community had gone to bed, their homes darkened for the night, leaving only a few sporadic lights glowing here and there. Beyond the compound's walls, the city pulsed with its usual nocturnal energy. Inside Pistorius' house, no one except the two of them knew the full truth of the situation. Yet the tension was real, looming in the silent spaces, waiting for the sequence of events that would soon lead to a tragic turning point. Nightfall brought a deep, pervasive silence to the gated community's winding streets. Dim, yellow street lamps cast slender beams on the sidewalks, and a hush settled over manicured lawns. High-tech security systems and tall walls provided a sense of safety to residents who expected to sleep undisturbed. Yet sometime around midnight or shortly after, that fragile peace was shattered in the home of Oscar Pistorius. Multiple reports suggest that the sounds, variously described as shots or loud banging, were heard after midnight, though exact timelines vary. Some neighbors reported what they interpreted as gunfire. Others claimed to have heard shouting or a scream. Those initial, frantic phone calls to security or police were laced with confusion. Nonetheless, it quickly emerged that something dire had happened in Pistorius' residence. Police records indicate that Riva Steenkamp had been fatally shot. The circumstances remain contentious. In his account, Pistorius claimed he believed an intruder had broken into his home. Yet from the vantage of an outside narrator, it is hard to determine the precise details of this fatal encounter. The official statements, forensic evidence, and subsequent trial would delve into every aspect of that night. Yet debate persists over what truly happened in those crucial moments. By the time neighbors realized gunshots had been fired, the atmosphere of the secure, upscale complex had already transformed. Panic replaced the usual calm, and security guards arrived at Pistorius's door to a chaotic scene. Some neighbors claimed they had heard screams, while others only heard the shots. Regardless, the cumulative effect was a jolt of fear that rippled through the entire community. Emergency services were alerted almost immediately. Ambulances and police cars swarmed the site, their sirens piercing the night. On entering Pistorius's house, responders found that Steenkamp had sustained multiple gunshot wounds, including a head wound, which would soon prove fatal. Medical personnel attempted to stabilize her, but the injury was too severe. Within a short span, she succumbed to her injuries, casting a pall of horror over the scene. Police began conducting a swift yet thorough investigation of the residence. They found shell casings, examined the door to the bathroom, where, according to some accounts, Steenkamp was sheltering when the shots were fired, and documented bloodstains. The arrangement of bullet holes, the state of the broken door, and multiple other forensic indicators would become key elements in the case to come. Oscar Pistorius himself was in a distraught state, reportedly in shock, which did not prevent the police from taking him into custody for questioning. Initial statements conveyed that he had fired the shots believing an intruder was hiding behind a closed door. Contradicting accounts suggested that this might have been a domestic dispute turned violent. In the gripping drama unfolding that night, no version of events yet offered a conclusive explanation. As the hours wore on, forensic teams carefully photographed and documented every inch of the scene. Police tape and barricades were erected to keep out onlookers, although rumors spread quickly, and soon a crowd of curious onlookers, local journalists, and eventually international media descended on the gates of the compound. The quiet, prestigious community found itself thrust into the global spotlight, overshadowed by tragedy. By the earliest hours of February 14th, Riva Steenkamp had died, and Oscar Pistorius had been taken into custody on suspicion of murder. Within the walls of that once calm home, a tragedy had played out that would shake the entire world. The athlete's personal crisis, his tearful explanations of a fatal mistake, the heartbreak of losing a young woman in her prime, would become a central narrative in courtrooms, television screens, and tabloids everywhere. The journey of fate had reached its most devastating moment. A champion once celebrated by millions now stood accused of a horrific crime. In those few, shattering minutes, a single volley of bullets had ended one life and irrevocably changed another. By morning, newspapers in South Africa and beyond blazed with the headline, "Murder at Oscar Pistorius' home." Many refused to believe it at first. Pistorius was more than an athlete. He was a global figure who had inspired countless people by competing in both the Paralympics and the Olympics, an example of indomitable human spirit. The notion that he had taken the life of his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp, on Valentine's Day was so shocking that the world struggled to process it. Throughout that early morning, police continued their meticulous investigation inside the house. The body of Riva Steenkamp was removed, and forensic experts scoured every inch of the property, gathering evidence. Neighbors spoke of hearing screams and multiple shots, conflicting with the idea of a single accidental discharge. While details remained sparse in the press, the overall picture was dire. The leading police officers declared this was not an open and shut case of a mistaken intruder. Within hours, the story exploded across international news outlets. Leading wire services posted urgent bulletins. Television reporters took up positions outside the gated community, capturing images of parked police vans and crime scene tape cordoning off the property. The magnitude of the news was overwhelming. One of the world's most admired athletes was now facing suspicion of a violent crime. In the world of sports, the collective disbelief was palpable. Several commentators initially described it as a tragic accident, referencing the possibility that Pistorius had feared a break-in. But as more details came to light, such as statements about repeated gunshots or neighbors hearing arguments, the narrative of a tragic misunderstanding was challenged. Sponsors and major brands that had aligned themselves with Pistorius acted swiftly, suspending or terminating their contracts. Social media erupted. Thousands of individuals from all walks of life expressed their sorrow for Steenkamp, condemnation of Pistorius, or general confusion at the situation. Some urged caution, calling for due process and an end to the rush to judgment. Others were resolute that such an act could not be an accident, especially given the multiple gunshots reported. Photos and personal testimonies about Steenkamp, a model and aspiring TV personality, circulated widely, underscoring the magnitude of the loss. Throughout South Africa, discussions about gun ownership, the reliability of security systems, and the phenomenon of violent crime in affluent neighborhoods flared up. This case brought renewed attention to laws on firearm possession and the phenomenon of high-profile celebrities living behind fortified walls in fear of home invasions. Authorities would later confirm they were pursuing a charge of premeditated murder, though Pistorius' legal team fervently opposed that characterization. Steenkamp's family and friends, meanwhile, found themselves in the harsh glare of the media spotlight, grappling with inconsolable grief. Though they tried to maintain privacy, they were frequently approached by reporters seeking statements. With heavy hearts, they described her as a bright, caring individual whose life had been abruptly cut short. The story resonated in public discourse as yet another tragedy of domestic violence. Over a span of just a few hours, the unthinkable became a bitter reality. A global icon had fallen from grace, and a promising young woman was dead. The emotional toll was profound. Many who had once placed Pistorius on a pedestal felt betrayed. Could a hero do such a thing? Was it all a horrible accident? Or had a darker side to this celebrated figure gone unnoticed until that fateful night? Rather than diminishing over time, the shock only intensified with each detail that trickled out. Ballistic reports, witness testimonies, and the ongoing investigation stoked more questions. The media followed every update with breathless intensity, and each new revelation brought fresh doubt or suspicion. At the core of it, however, lay an inescapable truth. Riva Steenkamp was gone, and the man accused of her death was someone the world had once revered as a beacon of perseverance. Everything that followed, legal proceedings, public outcry, and the unraveling of Pistorius' sterling reputation, would keep the world's attention riveted on a single, harrowing question. Was this a horrific error or a deliberate act of violence? In the days and weeks following the tragedy, an uneasy calm settled over the scene, but the legal and public fallout had only begun. With Oscar Pistorius in custody, prosecutors presented their case. The killing of Riva Steenkamp, they argued, was not a mere accident, but an act of murder. The defense countered that their client genuinely mistook Steenkamp for a burglar. Yet both sides found themselves grappling with an array of unanswered questions. Amid the swirl of forensic reports and ballistic data, the public latched onto every fresh development. Investigators examined the bathroom door and bullet trajectories, studied phone records, pored over messages the couple might have exchanged. Every detail became a piece in an intricate puzzle that no one could fully assemble. The lack of any eyewitnesses other than Pistorius himself made the truth elusive. In the broader social conversation, suspicions deepened. Could there have been a third party? Asked conspiracy theorists fueling online chatter. Others wondered if Pistorius might have been framed or pushed to a breaking point. These claims, however, failed to produce tangible evidence that challenged the core investigation, which held that everything happened within the confines of Pistorius' home. Worldwide, the question, how could someone so celebrated commit such an act, lingered. This once revered athlete, a symbol of hope and defiance of physical limitations, was now dissected under an unforgiving media lens. Some remained firmly in his corner, insisting that everyone deserved the presumption of innocence. Others declared that no champion could harbor such lethal impulses unless he had always been capable of violence, hidden behind the veneer of sports glory. The sports world faced a reckoning of its own. Endorsement deals that had been cornerstones of Pistorius' revenue swiftly vanished, and charities that once showcased him as an inspirational figure withdrew their support. Talk shows and tabloids couldn't stop asking, is the Pistorius brand tarnished beyond repair? Debates about how to handle his past records and awards cropped up, though the legal outcome remained unresolved. The trial itself turned into a spectacle of legal maneuvers, televised testimonies, and fervent public scrutiny. Prosecutors pointed to what they saw as inconsistencies in Pistorius' account, emphasizing that neighbors claimed they heard a woman screaming before the gunshots. The defense stressed the country's high crime rate and Pistorius' known apprehension about intruders, reinforcing the possibility of a horrible mistake made in the heat of fear. For the Steenkamp family, consumed by grief, there was only one certainty: their beloved daughter was gone. Her aspirations, her future, all cut short. In press conferences, they demanded justice and clarity, though the slow grind of the judicial process offered little consolation. At times, they watched as public focus drifted toward the spectacle of Pistorius' fall rather than the memory of Riva's lost life. Still, the question persisted, echoing like a riddle. Was this truly an accident, or had a deeper, more sinister dynamic been at play? Each new witness and piece of evidence seemed to tilt the scale back and forth. Some maintained that a single shot might be explainable as an impulsive mistake, but the cluster of shots suggested something else entirely. Even after verdicts and appeals, the world remained divided. For some, the legal judgments and prison time served could never erase the enormity of what had happened. For others, a narrative of tragedy, 2 lives destroyed in the span of seconds, felt more accurate. The idea that Pistorius had once stood for the triumph of human resolve was forever overshadowed by the memory of that Valentine's Day. And so, the final chapter of his last 24 hours remains etched as a cautionary tale. A hero to millions, undone by a single night's horror, leaving behind an unspeakable loss, Riva Steenkamp's life, which can never be regained. To this day, debates persist about the real circumstances, fueling speculation and reflections on the fragility of life and the depths of human error or malice. In the end, only questions linger. No matter which side emerges in the legal arguments, public opinion has formed a labyrinth of competing theories. Each new article, documentary, or rumor feeds the storm of doubt. Perhaps the most piercing question is, how does a champion of resilience become the focal point of such unspeakable tragedy? As the camera fades out, we're left with the unsettling truth that in a single night, everything can change. A stellar career can be obliterated, a bright future extinguished, and a global audience left reeling, searching for answers they may never find. Even now, many ask themselves if the official story is the full story or if an undiscovered dimension still lurks in the shadows. Regardless of the uncertainties, one thing remains certain. The final 24 hours of Oscar Pistorius' life as a free man shook the world to its core, and their legacy endures as a somber reminder of how fragile and fleeting our stories can be.